action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, advertising and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today, I've caught Jenni Romaniuk. Jenni is Research Professor and Associate Director at that conveyor belt of marketing stars, the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, where she has advised many of the world's biggest brands. She is the author of Building Distinctive Brand Assets and How Brands Grow Part 2, co-authoring the latter with industry legend Professor Byron Sharp, as well as being an engaging and entertaining keynote speaker at global industry conferences. Jenni says marketing is a science, but we try to dress up marketing science with theories borrowed from other sciences, rather than construct theories that reflect the actual marketing world. Welcome to the show, Jenni.
Thanks, Giles.
Right, so we always start with 7 quickfire questions, Jenni, such as Mac or PC, but given we're talking to a master of distinctive assets, we've thrown a few of those in too, so you can choose by subjectivity or uniqueness, fame as you see fit.
Okay.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Fame or uniqueness?
Uniqueness. Fame's easier to build, uniqueness is harder.
Good answer. McDonald's Golden Arches or Nike Swoosh?
McDonald's Golden Arches, I think they've done more creative things with it. Nike Swoosh has kind of just been there. It's been a bit lazy. Irony, really, for a Nike.
It is. Tiffany Blue or UPS Brown?
Oh, God, I'd always go Tiffany Blue. I have several of it in my house, and I hope to continue to have more.
Right, bottles now. Absolute vodka or Coca-Cola bottle?
Oh, I love Coca-Cola bottle. I love the story of how it was developed, that it was just someone asking, I want something that people can identify it's Coke even in the dark if they grabbed it.
Yeah, it's brilliant, that. Slightly odd, Colonel Sanders or George Clooney?
Oh, that's a tough one. That is a really tough one because KFC, when I grew up, that was the first fast food place that came to my town in South Australia, Whyalla. And every pay day, we could have takeaway. And every 4 weeks in a family of 4, I got to choose the takeaway, and it was always, my choice was KFC. But it's George Clooney. I don't think I need to explain that anymore. So I'm going to have to put that as a...
Perfect. Moving on. Last one, Snickers or Toblerone?
Toblerone, because the shape is such an iconic element of it, and it looks pretty.
Good answer. Perfect. Thanks, Jenni. So we always like to start by asking people what their first job was. I think importantly, there's a lot of value in understanding that talented folk don't always step straight out of a shiny college straight into a shiny career. I've too many nieces and nephews worried about doing things the right way. So how did life start for you, Jenni? What was your first job, and then what was your first marketing job?
Oh, okay. Well, my first job was actually when I was 14 in the Central Districts Football Club. I worked behind the bar doing all the soft drinks. And my great skill was I learned to make a fruit cup, which is it's like a traffic light drink where you have green, orange, and red layered colours in a single drink. And it requires having them in the right viscosity and pouring them very carefully to get those layers. And I ended up having to get me let go for that job when they realised, I think about 6 months into it, that it was actually illegal for me to be behind the bar being underage, even though I wasn't serving alcohol. Someone hadn't read the fine print on the liquor licensing law until they did, and then went, oh, sorry, we can't have you here anymore. My first marketing job was a funny one. It was working for the Independent Order of Odd Fellows to help them get membership. And the irony is that the Independent Order of Odd Fellows is like the Masonic, the Mason, the Freemasons.
Yeah.
Like it's a fraternal society. And you know the thing about fraternal societies?
Yeah, go on.
It's in the name, fraternal. They don't let women in. So I did a marketing plan for them. And then they're like, so do you want to stay and implement it? And I kind of had to say, no. And part of that was, so you want me to market something I can't actually join because I am not a man. And I had wanted, I'd already planned to go traveling overseas. So I did the typical Aussie backpacker thing. But, I did 3 months working on this marketing plan. I learned a lot of weird stuff about fraternal societies. Because I knew nothing, obviously, going in. So I had to do a lot of research into it and work out what the barriers to membership and how they could build it and things like that. And, that was it. It was a 3-month gig, and I saw it as just a way that I could put my skills in action and earn enough money to leave the country, which I did, and then went backpacking for 2 years before I came home after that to start actually at what was then the Marketing Science Centre that turned into the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute.
Oh, fantastic. So how did you actually end up in marketing science then? Because also I understand you originally studied occupational therapy.
Yes. So everything for me has just been happy accidents. I did occupational therapy for 1.5 years and realised I was not very good at it. So I'm like, I don't know what to do. And I'd always been quite good at economics, but didn't want to be an accountant or work for the government. So I was like, don't know what you do with that. And my other strengths were physics, maths. Don't know what you do with any of those. And so I was at a boarding college with lots of people doing different degrees, and someone was doing this thing called a business degree. And I went, oh, that sounds practical. So I signed up for that. And then I'm not very good at reading paperwork. And so I turned up for enrolment, and it was in the days we didn't do it online. You actually went to a big hall and stood in line and went to a desk and, signed up for your subjects. And I hear, finally get up to close to the thing, and I just hear them say, so what's your major? And I'm thinking, huh? What? Major? Business degree. God, all right. So, it went pretty quickly, and suddenly I'm there, and all I remember is just going, all right, well, I hear they do marketing well here, so I'll just do marketing. No idea what I was actually signing up for. Just kind of went, that sounds like that would do. Started a marketing degree, and then finished the degree, no idea what I wanted to do. So I decided to go backpacking. I met some friends from the US, discovered a working holiday visa, did that, and then came back. And again, I'm like, all right, now I have to find a job. Went for some really excruciating job interviews for jobs that I was blatantly not suited for. And then there was an ad in the paper to do your master's by research in marketing. Oh, and just to preface it, before I'd gone away, Byron had actually called me up and said, we're recruiting people to do, a master's by research in marketing. Are you interested? And I said, well, yeah, kind of, but I've just bought my ticket to go overseas, so not right now. But thanks, appreciate it. So when I came back, they advertised, and it is the one and only time they've ever advertised. And I answered that advertisement and went and presented. And they're like, okay, well, yeah, all right, you want to start? And I went, okay. And started. And my only criteria for taking the job was I could earn enough money to move out of home because my parents were driving me crazy after 2 years of traveling. And I was stuck in my parents' house with no money going, I just need to leave anything. I love my parents, don't get me wrong, but, so that's how I started on my illustrious thing. And I finished my master's, thought about leaving, and they convinced me to do a PhD. And I kind of went, oh, okay, yeah, I'm enjoying this. I'm finishing my PhD, and I kind of didn't want to be an academic. So I looked at doing a maths PhD because I thought, I like this PhD thing. This is fun. Be a big project to work on and stuff. And then I got convinced to apply for a research fellow position and went that way instead.
Amazing. And did you early on feel that you had found somewhere that you felt really comfortable in, given it gave you that facility to use your kind of scientific skills, your fondness for mathematics and physics? Did that feel like a nice fit for you?
Yeah, I mean, the degree didn't, because when we did the degree, we didn't do any of the math stuff, none of the modelling stuff they do now. It was all pretty standard, what we would call quite old-fashioned marketing degree when I first started. And I mean, doing a business degree, I was a very haphazard student. I was living at a boarding college, so I was just doing a lot of partying and doing the assignments I had to do. And I was pretty much in danger of failing one subject every semester, which I remind them now because right now they have quite strict criteria for people doing a research degree. You know, you have to have such a GPA, be a star student. And I keep reminding them that based on that criteria, they might not have picked me to come in now if I came along, because, you know, sometimes you don't know what you want to do. And when I started doing a research degree, see, to me, the marketing it's interesting, but the solving problems, I'm a researcher at heart, and I happen to be a marketing researcher by trade.
Right.
So I like solving problems. I don't care what they are. I happen to be in a career that I enjoy that is marketing, and it's about people and their fascinating problems. But it's the problem solving that appeals to me more than anything. So if you had to say, marketing researcher, which is the dominant, it's definitely the researcher that's applied into a marketing context.
Yeah, gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And at what stage then in your career did you start working on and thinking about the How Brands Grow Part 2?
I started that because I always like the idea of writing a book. I've always been a big reader, one of those people who go, I want to write. And, you know, the thing about writing, that they say is that, you know, most people want to write, few people actually sit down and write. And I was talking to, the idea came out with a conversation with Leanne Cutts, who's currently HSBC. I think her title was CMO there, or global CMO. But she was at Mondelez at the time, and she came and visited us because her she has family in Adelaide. And we sat down at lunch, and she brought out How Brands Grow, and she said, I want to see this book, but I want to see it written for emerging markets. And I'd been toying around with writing a book of different things, and we knew there was more stuff we wanted to build on from How Brands Grow. And I went, that sounds like a plan. So that was the original plan for How Brands Grow Part 2. The only challenge with that was when we started doing a lot of research into emerging markets, they weren't that different. So a book on How Brands Grow Part 2 Emerging Markets was going to be a very short book, which was just going to be See How Brands Grow, which isn't much of a writing challenge for those people to take on that first book. So we had to think, all right, well, what do we do? So that's where we added in things, and we sort of started with the behavioural stuff, dealing with the people who had asked us about their categories because they felt they weren't properly represented in How Brands Grow, and the different situations there. So looking at luxury, looking at new brands, but then starting to introduce the other work we were working on, which is more about how to grow brands, which, you know, talked about mental and physical availability, distinctive assets, etc. So, you know, the book kind of evolved into its own being once we sort of set the framework out, and then just started to go in and thought about what is interesting, what is useful, what do we need to spend time on versus what can we just really say, you know, we've already shared that with you, we don't need to share that again.
Fantastic. And then how did that develop into your book on building distinctive brand assets?
Yeah, we started. So one of the things that came out, so mental availability is so our whole mental availability program. A lot of that came out of the PhD I did, which was looking at the different ways the stuff in people's heads influences the choices they make, and setting up hypotheses about brand associations and how that might happen, and testing three different hypotheses. One of them was that it's an individual bit of knowledge. That, for example, I know Campari, which I'm just looking at now, is a good pre-dinner drink, and that single bit of knowledge is what makes me buy Campari. Or it could be that it's a set of knowledge, so a small subset of things. So there are things about alcoholic spirits, and there's a set of associations that if you've got that magic set, that's what gets you chosen. And then the third hypothesis, which came out of a combination of me reading a lot about how memory works, understanding perceptual patterns, understanding how brands are bought, was this idea of maybe it's just how much knowledge I've got about Campari that determines whether or not it's something I'm going to buy relative to other brands in the category. And it turned out that that was the thing that was most supported. And the surprising thing for most people is that my PhD was actually on services and B2B. So it was actually in banking, insurance, and telecommunications, and both B2C and B2B. So when people go, do the principles of mental availability, how brands grow, do they apply to those categories? I go, yeah, they were actually developed on those categories.
Yeah.
It's just that merging of the thinking side of it with the work that Andrew Ehrenberg had done, which was largely in packaged goods. There was that, and then we became more famous for the work in packaged goods because they were the categories that adopted it more early. And so so that then led to, okay, so how do we actually build mental availability? And one of the things that seemed really obvious to us is this idea that for anything to build mental availability, any marketing activity, it has to have good branding. And so we would do presentations. We'd say an essential ingredient is good branding, and everyone would nod and agree and go, yes, good branding, really important. Let us show you our latest ad. It's really well branded. And then they would show me an ad that had no branding except for the last 3 seconds. And I'd be like, so you were going to show me the ad that was well branded? They're like, yeah, that one. See, the brand, really big. It's there. It's it hits you right at the end after you've watched the whole ad. And I realized that this idea of good branding, there was a miscommunication. And so that led down a whole path of working out what is good branding, stream of work looking at direct branding tactics, and then these things called distinctive assets, which then evolved into a whole heap of developing the measurement, the metrics, the work we did. So we do a lot of work with companies, and we've been doing that for over 5 years now. And it was in those discussions with companies as we're debriefing them on the results for their particular assets that I realized that I'd have a conversation with some people and I'd be thinking, oh, those guys we did that project with 6 months ago, they'd really benefit from this conversation. But they weren't there and they didn't ask those questions. And then I'd get another question. And so the book evolved from all of the questions that people were asking us when they were trying to build, choose, evolve their distinctive and use their distinctive assets. So that's how that book actually came about. It just kind of, if anything, it wrote itself. It was so much easier to write than How Brands Grow Part 2.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm fascinated by distinctive assets, and you hit on a few points there actually that I'd like to pick up on. And I wonder if perhaps one of the reasons why it was so easy to write is because people typically, like the ad example you just shared, where someone said, we want to show you our great, well-branded advert. When you say the word brand, people in some walks of life just think of logo, and of course that's always the key. That's the brand name often, and the main anchor that people probably have when it comes to the mental associations they have with a company. But the indirect branding, am I right in saying that is all of the distinctive assets? That is your brand codes or whatever, however you want to articulate it. So going back to our 7 quickfire questions for Nespresso, that could be George Clooney. He is an indirect branding asset of sorts.
Yeah, so if you think about it in memory terms, so the brand name is a node in memory. It's a part of your memory for Nespresso. Now, attached to that are things that can lead you down the path to Nespresso. So George Clooney is one of those, but it's not Nespresso, it's George Clooney. And you have to make that mental leap from George Clooney to Nespresso and not get distracted by Ocean's 11, all of the other things George Clooney does in the way. So that's why it's indirect branding, because you still have to do that extra step to get the brand into your memory. Whereas direct branding, you're just going straight, it's Nespresso, there's no extra step. So when you have indirect branding, there's always a chance of retrieval failure, which means you have to work to keep that link up. When it's direct branding, what you see is what you want to reinforce. So that's why we separate the two out, because they do signal to you that there is a chance of retrieval failure. You can see George Clooney and not think of Nespresso.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I imagine retrieval failure, as you put it, can happen for a variety of reasons, not least, where the person is in the world. They might not be as familiar. They might be more familiar with his acting career than his preference in coffee, although I'm sure he takes a fair wedge to have that preference.
Well, there's two major causes of retrieval failure. One is decay. The natural state of memory is to decay. The longer you are from an initial, after you've got a link in memory, the harder it is to retrieve. It's just a natural process of how our brain works. And the other, as you just highlighted there, is mental competition, other things that are attached to the retrieval cue other than the target thing you want to retrieve. And this is always the problem with celebrities as distinctive assets, is they're cluttered. They've got lots of associations with them. So their strength, which is, that they draw attention because they feel familiar, is also their weakness as a branding asset, because there's all these other associations that make it difficult for a brand to break through in the clutter.
And I suppose you have a lot of competition equally in certain categories. So there's numerous celebrities. If I think of watches as a category, but I'm not too sure which watch is I should be associating, which brand with the individual, because it is so rife. It's almost that problem of everyone following the trend, because there's this weird perceived safety in numbers when really the opposite is true, and you should be going for uniqueness and fame as much as you can.
Yeah, it's really, there are some categories that, particularly if we take faces as an example, whether it be characters, celebrities, spokespeople, there are some categories that are very cluttered and some that hardly use any at all. One of my favourite uses of characters was actually Mama and Papa for Domio. Because in a category that doesn't have a lot of faces, they were two very clear, distinct ones. Unfortunately, I don't think they're used anymore, as goes with a lot of distinctive assets. But, that's an example of an asset in a category that doesn't have a lot of faces. So it makes it easier for the brand to really own it. Whereas if you're in breakfast cereal and you launch another cartoon animal character, you've got a lot of other, to program against type, you have to work quite hard because there's a lot of bases already covered.
And is that then, am I right in thinking, I'm deliberately dumbing this down for my own benefit as much as anything, but am I right in thinking then the memory works that we like to compartmentalize things as we process them? So an example I often use, especially when we talk around this area, is when you try a new meat, it often tastes like chicken because you're so keen to put it in a box that you recognize, an association that you recognize.
Yeah, anytime something new goes into memory, it has to have context. And so it has to basically attach itself to our existing network. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So if you've ever sat next to two people who are speaking a different language that you don't speak, even if you listen carefully to the words, you won't remember them because your brain has no context as to where to put it. It's why learning a language is so hard, because our first time we learn, we have to learn the foreign language word, our own native language word in our own network. to get to then the meaning that is associated with that. So it's like a multi-step process. And as we get fluent, we skip over our native language word and just go straight from the foreign language word to the meaning. So that's when we get that, oh, I can now think and be fluent in there. So we always have to be careful about the fact that whenever we have to we have to provide context. Now, when you're a new brand, that context will typically be the category area that you're in. So, for example, if I said to you the brand avocado, what would you think of?
Well, naturally, fruit and veg.
Yeah, it's not. It's actually a mattress company.
Okay.
But you wouldn't know that. Yeah, there's some weird mattress company names.
Yeah, it's bizarre. That is bizarre. Is that an Aussie brand?
No, it's actually a US brand. There's some weird ones. Purple is another one, and so stuff. So unless avocado tells us they're a mattress company, if I say the brand avocado, it's not going to go to the mattress part of your brain. Why would it? So we always have to have context to put it in. And when we're building distinctive assets, the context is the brand. When we're building a brand, the context is the broad category area that we're operating in. Otherwise, things can't stay in our memory and they can't be retrieved later. So the anchor for anything we want to build, we always have to be really clear on that. That anchor has to be something familiar, something that's already in our brain, and if we want to attach new information to it. So that's how I think about it. So the reason why you're saying in your example, everything tastes like chicken is because that's an anchor point in our brain, a reference point for it. Now, I'm sure there is some, like if I gave you kangaroo, have you ever eaten kangaroo?
I have, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So if you ate kangaroo for the first time, you wouldn't say that tastes like chicken, would you?
No, but it depends who I'm talking to, who's asking the question, because it might just be an easy, lazy reference. But I take your point.
Yeah, people would more say venison, or I was talking to someone who had it for the first time, and that was their reference point for it. So there's always a reference point, but it's always something that we know. And you would only say venison if you'd eaten venison before and you knew what venison tastes like. Otherwise, it would be a sensible reference point. So it's always about thinking about where is it going into someone's network. And I think it's one of the things that is neglected a lot in our communications, that basics of what is my anchor, what am I adding? And thinking about that can help us just get a little bit more looking at our work from a memory perspective, not just an immediate reaction perspective.
What is a distinctive asset in terms of how does that manifest? Can it be literally anything that triggers the brand? Can it be a sound, a smell?
Yeah, it can. Yeah, it is in some instances. There's all sorts of things. So, how do you Subway with a smell? You go past a Subway, you can usually smell it a while back if they're baking their bread, for better or for worse. I know some people who love that smell. I know some people who hate it. It can be anything that's sensory. Now, in reality, in marketing, we use audio and visual, and we tend to use visual more than audio because audio is obviously limited in its opportunity to use. Visual is the one where you have the most common opportunity to use. Audio after that, and then some of the others are sound, touch, and smell. Also, taste, touch, and smell also can come into play depending on the category.
And do you find that brands are mostly aware of what their distinctive assets are? Because you gave a great Dolmio example there, where a brand, we believe, has ceased to use arguably its most kind of prominent distinctive assets.
No, most of the time people have poor judgment on it simply because it's very hard to see how bad the tornado is when you're in the middle of it, for want of another analogy. You know what I mean? If you're living and breathing and it's all around you, it's very hard to get perspective. And so what happens is you do a couple of things. One is you overplay the importance of the things you've worked on. So if you've been working on a new tagline, you believe that is all important, when paradoxically, the fact that you've been working on it, changing it, has probably decreased its value rather than increased it. You neglect the things that you've neglected, which again, paradoxically, has probably made them more valuable, because if they've been left alone, they might actually be stronger. Not always the case. Just having an asset doesn't mean it's strong, because presence isn't enough for prominence. So many a time we test pack assets that have been on the pack for decades, but they don't register very strong as individual assets because they've never been treated as separate associations. They've only ever been built in the one context. And the other thing is you tend to underestimate what competitors are doing and what's cut through there. So uniqueness scores, people just often don't have a sense of what competitors have been doing and what might be competing for their brand, either their own brand's potential assets or competitors' own assets themselves. So that's why objective measurement is so important, because we're just not very good judges of these things, and our own actions hamper our capacity to be objective judges of our own activities or those around us.
Yeah, we met. I had the pleasure of meeting you at DMX in Dublin fairly recently, actually, and your talk there, which was wonderful, focused.
Feels like a lifetime ago.
I know, it does. So much has changed. You spoke there about these kind of predators that distinctive assets face, and they might not all be external. They might not be competition. It might just be a lack of understanding and awareness within an organization. What are the best practices for managing distinctive assets and even measuring distinctive assets? How easy is that to do?
Measuring is quite easy as long as you do it right. And this is where you have to think about what is the purpose of an asset. So one of the things we did was develop an approach to measurement, because we realized there were no metrics for this. And when you have no metrics, what happens is the loudest voice wins, and the loudest voice might not be the best voice. So we developed metrics, and our metrics were based on empirical testing. We tested different approaches, but also being mindful of what we want assets to do. And what we want assets to do is to trigger the brand automatically without the brand being present. So that led us down a couple of paths of what's likely to be the best measure. First of all, the cue has to be the asset, not the brand, because we want to cue the brand. If the brand's there, you don't kind of need the asset. And secondly, that it has to be unprompted, because that's what allows you to not just get if the brand is triggered, but what other brands might be triggered as well, because you don't know what people are going to say if they see the asset without context. So we came up with the thing of we need a cue, we need something to retrieve, and then I tested these basically in a 2x2 matrix, whether you cue the brand or the asset, whether you prompt or unprompt. And the asset cued unprompted was the best approach on a number of fronts. It gave you the most competitive linkages, and you asked me about which is better, fame or uniqueness to have. Uniqueness is better to have because you can't control it, because it's predicated on what other people do, what other brands are doing, and you can't control that. I mean, you can try and sue and have legal protection and things like that, but it's still a little bit out of your control. That's painful to do and rarely successful. Whereas fame, you can control, because that's how you use assets and how well you execute and how widespread your execution is. So we want to make sure we've got as good a handle on competitors' potential encroachment on assets as possible, because we can't control that, but we need to know it to manage it. And depending on the type of competitor encroachment will indicate whether or not it can be rescued or it's best abandoned. And then what we also need to do is we want a conservative assessment. We don't want an inflated score, because this is really important. If you don't brand, nothing else you do will work, because no matter how you believe advertising, marketing activity work, it can't work if they don't know who it's from. So our approach is what we call risk averse. It's actually very conservative. When you prompt for brands, we found you got up to 20 percentage points inflated scores. So that means that the real score might have been 60% and you got 80%. which is a lot of inflation for a metric to replace your brand name. And I'm hesitant to, suggest that would be a smart thing to base your strategy on, something that's inflated. So that's the measurement side of it. And getting that right is important, to have a realistic assessment of the most important metrics. Because, fame, it is what it is, and you can work with that. If it's low, that's the past, but you can build that. But uniqueness is the one thing you really do need to know in order it can make or break your asset success. And then, having those metrics are really important, because they not only let you know what to build, because once you realise you're building fame, you're building it amongst all category buyers, that influences where you do your asset building activities, how you do your asset building activities, all flows through to tactics. And that helps you then build, but then protect. So I've done some of the best studies I've done assessing distinctive assets for brands are when nothing has happened as a result of the research. Because the brief coming in was, we might get rid of this. We don't want it anymore. And we were able to demonstrate not only how strong the asset is, but also how precious it is in the context of the category, and how, you don't really want to get rid of it without a plan. So these are some things that, are just really important to have. So having the metrics and making sure you're assessing them right just stops you from making bad decisions, as well as helping you make good ones.
Perfect. And the distinctive asset grid, I've actually got that in front of me right now, which allows you to plot fame and uniqueness of your distinctive assets. That's not necessarily fixed or timeless then, is it? So that's a living thing, a living part of your brand. So you may find that you're plotting quite comfortably, say top right, which is our sweet spot, our target, but over time, for various reasons, that can change. So you do need to constantly monitor and measure.
Yeah, constantly, but not too. It's not something I would recommend putting it and doing continuous tracking of distinctive assets. Once a year, once every 2 years, for the assets that you either own or are building, is pretty much all you need. The hardest part is the benchmarking study, where you're really going, this is the lay of the land, and this is where we're setting the strategy for the next 5 years or so of what we're doing. And once you've got that, it is just the occasional checking update, but you've got to also have the systems in place to make sure you're taking advantage of every asset building opportunity. And that's where, in the book, I talk about the whole system of a management system, of how it works, and the things like building in waves, not trying to build too many at one time, but building a couple, and then once they're built, moving on to the next ones after that, because one strong asset is much better than 10 average ones. So, so we're thinking about that sort of strategy of building it into place. How that all comes together becomes really, really important. So the grid the grid's kind of a contractual thing. If you're an academic, it's in your contract that at some point in your entire career, you have to develop a 2x2 grid. Otherwise, you get disowned. You get to 60 and you haven't got your 2x2 grid. That's it. It's like, why did you try? No, I'm only joking. No disrespect to those who have not got a 2x2 grid, but I do think it's funny, because we always used to. No, when I was an undergraduate, we always used to joke about the 2x2 grids that we would get. So I find it quite ironic. I have my own now. But the idea of it is some people just operate better in pictures and some people operate in numbers. So it was about giving you a picture, particularly when you're deciding on where you're going. I actually wouldn't bother, like if I was tracking it, I think the few assets you should be tracking, you could probably do them more efficiently presented in a table, in the spirit of Andrew Ehrenberg and how to present information. He would say, what are you doing a fancy picture for that? A table will tell you just as nicely whether or not things have improved or gone down. So having the privilege of working with Andrew and having that instilled in me, that's how I would do tracking over time. Trying to demonstrate that on a grid is messy at best. But the grid is good to go, this is how we're laid out now, and, some sense of where we want to go.
So you wouldn't actually use it to plot against, you would just use it as your guide.
No, because the reason we typically use the grid in the benchmarking study, because that's when we're putting all the assets out, and you see things like, for example, you have 4 taglines that all tested low in the investment potential quadrant. Maybe one of the reasons they all tested low is you have 4 taglines.
Yeah.
We could cut that down to 1, and that might give one the opportunity to jump up pretty quickly. So and those things are easier to communicate when you've got a visual device to do it. Trying to show things on that sort of chart tracking over time, it's messy at best. I wouldn't recommend that as a data presentation tool, but as a let's just see where we are now tool, that can be really valuable. And also when we do our full reports, we do things like you can plot asset types. So you can say, well, you've got your 4 taglines here. How's everyone else's taglines looking? And it allows you to get some sense of which are the really competitive asset types and which are the asset types that maybe are a little bit freer and open. Which are the ones that, maybe one brand has conquered and others have failed, versus which are the ones where, no one's really got any traction. It just helps you understand, again, where the opportunities could be, because there are different things you can plot on that chart, on that grid.
And is it rare? You've touched on quantities of distinctive assets a couple of times, just loosely, but is it rare to find a brand with several strong distinctive assets, and is there an amount we should be looking at or aiming for as a business?
It's rare, but it's not. It's more uncommon than rare, I would say. And there are some brands that I've dealt with where actually the challenge is you've got too many. And what's happened is typically things like in emerging markets, if there's a big global player that's gone into emerging market and then they've added and added and added, and they haven't had a lot of competition, but you might see local players starting to emerge, particularly as emerging markets get more sophisticated. So there was a time when in a number of emerging markets, the local brands were seen as the cheap and nasty alternatives. But that's actually changed a lot in a lot of countries where there's a lot more pride and a lot more quality going into local brands in categories. So we're seeing that those initial global advantages are now being eroded. And one of the reasons they can get eroded is if you're trying to protect on too many fronts. So in that case, we then look at consolidation, and that might be consolidation around a theme or around an idea, where you might have things that are iterations on a root idea, but they can be brought back to it's actually the root idea that you're building, not the iterations of it. Sometimes it does require to go, you've got 3 strong taglines. You don't need 3 strong taglines. So, what are you going to give up? Because you might be missing an audio asset out of that, and there's only so many assets you can build. And then that becomes a thing of, okay, well, which of those taglines maybe has more longevity potential? Because some of those taglines might be very narrow in what they can be used. And while if you're a big dominant brand, you have the luxury of a narrow cast asset that's very specific to a situation, that might not be the best investment going forward in the long term versus something that could operate over multiple different campaign ideas and messages. So that's becomes more of a strategic discussion about where the brand's growing, that goes beyond the metrics and goes more into understanding how these might be used in the future.
Great answer.
I didn't ask you a question about how many. Just on that, the answer is it depends. I would go for diversity first. So the distinctive asset palette concept is this idea that you don't want a palette of 10 blues. You want a blue, a red, a green, because you don't know what you're going to paint. You will need more assets if you're in more diverse media and sales channels, because that will help you in those channels. But it comes back to what your budget for supporting them is. Because one of the things that will harm you in the long term is if you have a strong asset and you just don't use it. If you just don't use it, it just fades away. It won't fade away quickly overnight, but it will over time. That's why the top quadrant is called use or lose, because it just reminds people that if you don't use an asset, then the natural state of memory is it will decay over time.
Perfect, makes sense. Before I go off to work on my own 2x2 grid, I have a couple of listener questions, if I may.
Sure.
So, asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger. But we do have two for you. Question one is from Anne, and Anne says, companies such as PepsiCo, Mars, and Diageo have reframed their brand marketing to reflect the principles of how brands grow. Mass marketing seems to make sense in FMCG categories that typically have a lot of light users that make up a sizable chunk of the business. How does this work outside of FMCG, for example, in B2B? She also says, what other companies have adopted how brands grow?
Well, for what other companies have adopted how brands grow, I suggest just go onto the website and you can see our corporate sponsor list. That's a pretty good indicator of some. It's not all, because it is amazing how many I talk to companies and people go, oh yeah, we've read the book and we're doing things. But the ones who really want to stay ahead are actually become corporate sponsors, and they're listed on our website. But there's a whole range of different companies in there, and some big, some small, different areas of marketing, from cars to banks to insurance to, as well as packaged goods, a whole range of different types of companies. Because basically the idea of how brands grow works in any situation where you want someone to choose something when they've got multiple alternatives. And that multiple alternatives might play at a single point in time or over time. So we have actually some researchers who are really big in, really committed to the charity sector and non-profits. And we run workshops on how brands grow for non-profits, because even though they're not getting you to buy something, they still want your time, your commitment. That might be volunteering, it might be taking part in an event, it might be raising money, it could be a whole heap of things, as well as giving them money too. Adopting a dog, another thing. So basically any situation where you've got those multiple options and you want to direct people to choose whatever it is you want, that's when how brands grow can work.
Perfect. And Anne specifically talked around B2B, and funny enough, you clarified that earlier on in our chat, that actually a lot of your findings and a lot of your work actually originated in B2B, but there does seem to be that misconception that it's mostly geared towards consumer products.
Yes, the packaged goods companies do a very good job of promoting themselves. But it's always we love a whole range of different examples. So some of the work has been done on everything from buying of airplanes to airline fuel contracts to doctors prescribing antidepressants to hospitals buying coronary stents. You'd be surprised that different sorts of areas work being done. I talked about our non-profit work, looking at how people support charities. We did some work on donating blood and patterns that underpin blood donation. We love weird data sets from different areas of consumer behavior, and we love testing it. It's one of the fun things of the job of being a scientist, is you get to go, ooh. I actually did one recently where I looked at a competition between ways to solve pain. Because if you've got pain, there's a number of different things you could do to solve that. So if you've got chronic pain, how do you utilize those different areas of pain? And the answer is there's actually some underlying patterns that how people choose between ways to alleviate their pain. Go figure. Isn't it weird?
It's Yeah, it is quite weird. But then I suppose there's no reason why it should be any different. Our second question is from James, Jenny, and he asks, do you have a favourite distinctive brand asset?
I'm a very practical person. I love it when people take the ordinary and do something that's surprising, simple, and works. So one of my favorite distinctive assets, and it has been for a while because the thing is San Pellegrino with the foil top on the can. And the reason I like that is it's an unusual packaging asset. It takes a can, which everybody has, but turns it such that the brand is easy to find in buying situations, which is one of the biggest difficulties of canning out, particularly in retail environments. So that's one of my favorite ones because I just love the simplicity of it. It didn't require any fancy manufacturing, reshaping into unusual stuff, any complicated, I don't know how complicated it is to put a foil top on a can, don't get me wrong. I'm not downplaying that was probably someone invested a lot of time and energy to do that, but I just love the simplicity of it and how it took an ordinary everyday shape and turned it into something easily identifiable. And that's where I think when we start to get creative once we understand what distinctive assets are for, we can look at ways where we can make those what are not revolutionary changes in the actual creation or the design, but can have really big impact on the branding power of whatever we're doing.
Yeah, I love that example, especially because as you say, if you break it down, they've taken something that is so common in terms of the actual can itself, and just with a very slight adjustment have made that much more unique. I really like the trivial as well, the triviality of it, but that's something that affects everything, or many things in marketing, where there's that kind of butterfly effect of doing something seemingly trivial that has a massive, massive effect. Wonderful.
Yeah, I think sometimes we just overcomplicate things, where sometimes it's actually the simple things that have the best and greatest effect. So that's one of the things that I just love about it is it's just such a simple thing that someone thought of and implemented and works. And yeah, I love examples like that. So if anyone has any more, please feel free to send them to me because I do love collecting those sorts of examples.
Perfect. Well, we'll share details with how people can do that and get in touch on this episode. So the final part of the interview, Jenny, is our 4 pertinent posers that we put to all of our guests. Number 1 is, what advice would you give to your younger self other than avoid fraternities?
I would probably say, there's the standard things of relax, but I do wish I'd gone to Cuba earlier. I wish I'd gone to Cuba when Fidel Castro was alive. I know it has nothing to do with, I love travel. So, so it's one of my passions. The only New Year's resolution that I kept for 10 years was to visit 2 new countries every year. And so that was the one I felt like I missed because it kind of opened up before I got there, and I wish I'd gone earlier.
That's one of my favourite answers. What advice would you give to your younger self? Go to Cuba earlier. It's wonderful.
Yeah, well, Fidel Castro is still alive, yes.
Yeah.
Oh no, the reason for that is also I actually got to travel around Syria when old Assad was still alive.
Oh, wow.
And I got to see the most amazing country in the world. And it was only because I just went, I'm just going to do it. Because no one, and I went by myself because no one wanted to come with me. Everyone's like, you're going where? And to this day, I hold on to those memories as precious because no one will ever see that country like it was, like I saw it again.
Yeah, of course.
So that's the other reason why I go, all these other places I could have gone to if I'd gone earlier.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. Question 2, Jenny. If you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
Indices, because they're evil.
Don't hold back. They're evil.
No, they are. They're evil. They distract us because you can only get a big indices with a small base, and if it's got a small base, it by nature is going to be unimportant. So what we're doing is we're using a method to inflate the importance of the unimportant, and that's just evil. It's deceptive. So use numbers where you understand where they come from, and you don't have to do mental gymnastics to interpret them. And so, don't use indices. I would banish them tomorrow if I could.
Perfect. No, you're right though. There is a lot of that, and it's there is a lot of deception in our industry when it comes to data. You mentioned that you are a keen reader. So question 3 is, are there any books that you would recommend to our listeners? So these can be fact or fiction.
I don't know if people want to read my fiction, because I confess I'm a trashy sci-fi reader, and I just read all sorts of trash because I read so much serious stuff in my job that I love reading. So I like to and the thing about sci-fi in general I love is that it takes you to a world that you would not imagine being in. And so, so to me that is just fun. And it's very hard to prescribe people what sort of sci-fi they're going to like, because I know sci-fi is a pretty niche genre anyway. And if you do, there's even within sci-fi, there are all different sorts of iterations of it. So I'm hesitant to recommend specifics. If someone really loves sci-fi and they do want recommendations, email me, message me on LinkedIn, I'll do that. But what I do encourage people is to read for adventure. Read for things and experiences you don't get in your daily life, because the power of reading, and I noticed this when I didn't do it for a period of time and I relied on like watching TV and things like that. The power of reading is it makes your brain conjure up visual images. And when you do that, what happens is you are able to put things together in different ways. So I read everything. As a child, I read everything from Mills and Boon books to Wilbur Smith. So I know a lot about the diamond industry in South Africa, more than I ever really wanted to know, because they were the books that I could find at my parents' bookshelf.
Yeah.
So I just read everything. And I think the more widely read you are, the more you are able to pull together strings that no one else has seen, because you've got all these different inputs, because our brains are only as good as the stuff we put in them. And so the more creative and interesting and varied and unusual it is. If someone wants a really good travel book, though, this is a book that inspired me to go to Syria. It's a book called A Scandalous Life. And it's the story of Lady Jane Digby, who was the first woman to ever be exiled from Britain. And she ended up marrying a Bedouin prince who had the rights to take travellers to Palmyra in Syria. So she had a very adventurous life along the way to that. But A Scandalous Life is a biography of her time. And I'm really surprised it hasn't been made into a movie, because she had one hell of a life.
Fantastic. Funnily enough, sci-fi has come up a couple of times for almost exactly the same reasons. In fact, Murray Calder, quite early on in our podcasting, recommended Culture Series by Ian M. Banks.
Mm-hmm.
But I know he's a huge sci-fi fan, so you're in good company.
Okay. Yes, there's few of us, but we yes, yes, it's a cult.
Yeah, it is. Well, maybe it is. We'll link to a Scandalous Life, plus obviously building distinctive brand assets and how brands grow, part 2 on the listing. The fourth poser to put to you, Jenny, is we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow that honour to our guest, who has to give their reason why. So would you kindly dedicate this episode to somebody?
Oh, that's an easy one, for a sad reason. Professor Gerald Goodhart. I'm getting a bit emotional now. He died last week or the week before. He was, he worked with Andrew. He was the co-developer of the Dirichlet model. And he was just such a fabulous man. He was supportive. He was the type of person you could bounce out the most all over the place ideas, and he would say something simple that would put you on the right path.
Yeah, we need more people like that in the world. Well, Thank you, Jenni. This episode is very proudly dedicated to Professor Gerald Goodhart.
We actually dedicated How Brains Grow Part 2 to him as well. So there's a dedication at the front of that's to Gerald, because he just informed so much of the work that we do.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. That's lovely to hear, Jenni. As a final call to action, everyone listening can head over to this episode's listing and we'll share links to everything that we've discussed, including Jenni's books, links to Ehrenberg-Bass, A Scandalous Life. How else can people get more Jenni Romaniuk?
Right now, not a lot, because I'm in kind of writing mode and isolation. So, just kind of taking it quiet and doing some stuff. But stay tuned. Next year will be some more exciting stuff.
Oh, exciting. Fantastic.
That's all I can say.
Okay, fantastic. I won't push you then. Jenni, thank you so much for joining. It has been an absolute honour and a privilege to talk to you.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And you better go and walk Alfie and Honey.
Yes. They're actually both pretty quiet. Could you hear? I don't know if you could hear Alfie snoring, but I did have to kick him a couple of times because I was worried it would get on the recording.
I wish we had.
No, seriously. He snores really loudly.
I wish we had. Finally, thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it and review the pod. We greatly value your support. Keep questions and guest requests coming in too. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online. You can check out CTA Pod on Instagram or email hello@calltoaction.co.